U.S. destroyer sitting in the Persian Gulf, and somewhere out on the water, a swarm of attack drones is closing in fast. Dozens of them. The kind of attack Iran's forces had been refining for years, built to overwhelm a ship's defenses by sheer volume. But the destroyer doesn't fire a single bullet. No missiles launch. No CIWS spins up. Instead, a beam of directed energy sweeps across the sky, and one by one, the drones drop. Then the beam turns toward the ship that launched them. And that ship goes dark, then it sinks. This is what naval combat looked like in 2026, and it changes the math on everything. The Iranian swarm threat. To understand why this engagement matters, you need to know what a swarm carrier actually is, because it's not a warship in the conventional sense. It's a platform, a vessel built around one purpose: getting close enough to deploy dozens of small attack drones simultaneously, then letting them fan out and hit a target from multiple angles at once. The drones themselves don't need to be sophisticated. They don't need to be fast or stealthy or accurate in isolation. The whole point is that there are too many of them. You kill 10, 20 more are already past your outer defense layer. Iran developed this doctrine around a simple observation about how U.S. destroyers defend themselves. The Phalanx CIWS, the ship's last-line rotary cannon, can engage incoming threats fast, but it's one system firing at one threat at a time. The SM-2 and SM-6 missiles in the vertical launch cells can reach out further, but each one costs somewhere between $1 and $2 million, and a destroyer carries a finite number of them. Once those cells are empty, they stay empty until the ship returns to port. So Iran's calculation was this: if you send enough cheap drones, you force the ship to spend expensive interceptors, and eventually the math tips in your favor. A drone that costs a few $100s to build draws a response that costs $1 million to fire. Do that enough times and you've economically exhausted a billion-dollar warship without ever matching it in a straight fight. That logic had been playing out across the Red Sea corridor for a couple of years before this engagement. Houthi forces, operating with Iranian weapons and Iranian doctrine, had been launching exactly these kinds of attacks against commercial shipping and U.S. naval assets. Each incident stress-tested the intercept systems. Each one burned through more missiles. The Navy was watching the cost tallies pile up, and so was everyone else. What made the swarm carrier a specific escalation is that it moved the launch platform closer and compressed the engagement timeline. Drones launched from shore or from a distant vessel give defenders more time to react, more distance to work with. A dedicated carrier pushing into the Gulf approaches, cuts that window down sharply. Radar picks it up, operators identify the threat, and suddenly the drones are already in the air. By the time this particular carrier was tracked moving into intercept range of the destroyer, it had already deployed its first wave. The crew didn't have the luxury of a long decision cycle. The captain needed a response that could cycle faster than the drones, that didn't have a reload problem, and that didn't cost $1 million per trigger pull. The system they had aboard could do all three, but almost nobody outside the program knew it was ready for exactly this kind of fight. The system aboard that destroyer belongs to a class of weapons the Navy has been developing under several program names over the past decade, but the underlying technology is the same across all of them. A high-energy laser that focuses a sustained beam onto a target until the target fails. Not an explosion, not an impact. The beam sits there, and the material underneath it heats past the point of structural integrity. Aluminum warps, fuel ignites, electronics fry. Given enough dwell time, even a hardened casing gives way. What makes directed energy different from every kinetic system before? It isn't just the cost, it's the physics of the engagement itself. A missile or a cannon round has to account for where the target will be when the round arrives. At any meaningful range, that's a calculation that introduces error, especially against fast-moving or maneuvering targets. A laser travels at the speed of light. There's no lead time, no ballistic arc, no window for the target to move out of the path. Where the system points, the beam lands. Instantaneously. The fire control loop on a laser system is also fundamentally different from a kinetic one. With a missile, you commit, you launch, and then you wait. With a laser, the operator can hold the beam, adjust, release, and re-engage another target within seconds. Against a swarm that matters more than almost any other capability, you don't need to predict which drone to prioritize. You burn one, move to the next, burn that one, move on. The system can cycle through targets faster than any CIWS reload, faster than any vertical launch cell sequence, and it does it without consuming a single physical round. The cost per engagement is where the numbers get almost absurd to read out loud. Running a high-energy laser for a 1-second engagement on a drone-class target costs roughly a few dollars in shipboard electricity. Some estimates put it even lower than that depending on the power generation, system, and output level. Compare that to the intercept economics from the previous section, and the asymmetry isn't just favorable, it's a different category of problem entirely. The Navy hadn't kept this quiet. Shore-based and ship-mounted laser tests had been running for years. The USS Ponce carried an early prototype system back in 2014 and demonstrated it in the Gulf. The Arleigh Burke-class destroyers had been the subject of integration studies for higher output systems for most of the early 2020s. What changed by 2026 wasn't the concept, it was the maturity. Early systems were limited in output and struggled against anything moving fast or at significant range. The generation deployed on this destroyer had addressed both problems with higher beam quality and faster tracking. There's one more thing worth understanding about why a drone swarm is, counterintuitively, a near-ideal target for a laser system. Swarm tactics work against point defense systems because those systems have to prioritize and sequence. You can only shoot one missile at a time, and the drones exploit that queue. A laser doesn't have that problem. The engagement timeline for each target is short enough that the system moves through a swarm the way you'd clear items off a list, one after another, without pause. The volume of the attack, the thing that made the swarm doctrine effective against kinetic defenses, becomes almost irrelevant. The drones launched from that carrier ran straight into a system that was already built for exactly this fight. The first drones cleared the carrier's deck within seconds of launch. Radar tracks multiplied on the destroyer's display as the swarm spread into attack formation, each unit diverging slightly to approach from a different vector. The laser system's fire control had already begun prioritizing. No orders needed to go up a chain of command. The engagement logic was running before the drones had fully separated. What the crew watched from the deck wasn't dramatic in the way you might expect. There was no visible beam in daylight, no tracers, no smoke trails from outgoing rounds. Drones simply stopped flying. A flash at the airframe, sometimes a secondary ignition from the fuel cell, and then a piece of debris falling toward the water. The system moved to the next one before the first had hit the surface, then the next. The entire swarm engagement lasted under 2 minutes by most accounts of how these systems perform at that target density and range. When the last drone was gone, the carrier was still on the water, still maneuvering. At that point, the decision came down to what the rules of engagement permitted and what the threat picture looked like. The carrier had initiated an attack on a U.S. naval vessel. It was still capable of deploying additional waves. The captain redirected the laser. Engaging a surface vessel is a different problem than burning through a small airframe. A ship has mass, distributed systems, and compartmentalization working in its favor. But a directed energy beam doesn't need to sink a ship outright to mission kill it. It needs to find a vulnerability, a fuel line, an antenna array, a control surface, and dwell there long enough to cause cascading failure. The carrier's bridge and communication systems went first, based on what subsequent imagery showed. Then something in the aft section ignited. Not an explosion in the dramatic sense, a sustained fire that the crew couldn't contain. The carrier had a small crew or was running partial automation, because the response was almost none. No evasive maneuver, no attempt to broadcast a distress signal that was picked up on monitored frequencies. It listed, slowed, and went dark on radar over the course of about 40 minutes. By the time any other vessel could have reached it, it was gone. Iran's state media ran a different version. A technical malfunction, an accident, nothing involving a U.S. ship. But satellite imagery from commercial providers told a different story, and naval tracking logs from the region filled in the rest. The carrier's last recorded position, its disappearance from AIS and radar, and the timing all lined up exactly with what the destroyer's own logs reflected. Washington didn't hold a press conference. No official statement went out naming the engagement or the system involved. That restraint was deliberate, announcing a first combat use of directed energy against a nation-state vessel carries diplomatic weight that the administration apparently wasn't ready to spend publicly. But the information moved anyway, through defense channels, through allied navies who track these engagements closely, through the satellite imagery that anyone with a subscription could pull. Iran couldn't deny it cleanly and couldn't confirm it without admitting the loss in terms that exposed the failure of a doctrine they'd spent years building. So the official position stayed ambiguous, which in its own way confirmed everything. The engagement was over in under an hour from first drone launch to the carrier going under. No U.S. personnel were injured. No kinetic rounds left the destroyer. And the Navy had something it had never had before, a confirmed combat record for ship-mounted directed energy, earned not in a test range, but in an active threat environment, against a real attack, with real stakes. That changes what the next conversation looks like. Before 2026, directed energy was something navies demonstrated on test ranges against slow-moving target drones over calm water, with controlled power supplies and ideal atmospheric conditions. Every defense analyst knew the technology was coming. Nobody had seen it used in combat against a real threat with an actual adversary on the other end. That gap between demonstrated capability and proven weapon matters enormously in how other navies calculate risk. It's closed now. China's People's Liberation Army Navy has invested heavily in swarm concepts for exactly the same reason Iran did: volume as a force multiplier against expensive U.S. point defense systems. Houthi planners running Iranian doctrine in the Red Sea had the same logic baked into their targeting decisions. Every one of those calculations assumed that the ship on the other end would eventually run out of interceptors, or run out of budget, or run out of time. A laser with a deep magazine of ship's electricity rewrites that assumption from the ground up. The cost asymmetry that Iran exploited for years doesn't just narrow with directed energy, it inverts. Sending 100 drones at a laser-equipped destroyer doesn't exhaust the defender, it just gives the system more practice. And unlike a CIWS or a VLS cell, the laser doesn't need a port visit to reload. It runs as long as the ship's power generation runs. That said, the Navy hasn't solved everything, and it would be wrong to suggest otherwise. Atmospheric interference is a real constraint. Humidity, particulates, and salt spray in a maritime environment scatter a beam and reduce effective range and output. Engagement at distance is harder than engagement close in. A high-output beam also draws significant power from the ship's systems, which means operators are managing a real trade-off between propulsion, sensors, and the laser during a sustained engagement. These are engineering problems, not physics barriers, but they're not solved yet. What comes next is higher output. The systems in development now are targeting outputs that extend effective range and shorten dwell time against hardened targets. Integration on larger platforms, carriers, amphibious assault ships, gives those systems access to more power generation. There's early-stage work on the submarine side, though the technical challenges there are considerably steeper. The trajectory points in one direction: more power, more range, more platforms carrying it. Directed energy isn't experimental anymore. It has a combat record. Iran spent years and real money building the swarm doctrine into a credible threat. The logic was sound given the tools available to both sides at the time. A cheap, scalable attack method that stresses expensive U.S. hardware without requiring a conventional military confrontation. That's not a bad strategy. It held up until one afternoon and the Gulf broke it. What Iran does with that reality is the open question. Drone hardening is one path, trying to reduce the laser's dwell effectiveness with reflective materials or ablative coatings. Shifting toward faster, lower-flying approaches is another. Hypersonic delivery compresses the engagement timeline in ways that laser tracking hasn't fully addressed yet. None of those pivots are fast or cheap, and none of them restore the economic logic that made the swarm doctrine attractive in the first place. The Gulf is now a live testing environment for the next generation of naval warfare. Both sides know it. The laser didn't just stop that swarm, it retired an entire strategic playbook in a single engagement. If you want to go deeper on where directed energy weapons are headed next, that video's right here. Subscribe so you don't miss it when it drops.